$25,412. That's the number that used to make my hands shake. That's the number I said out loud to a bank fraud investigator, to a detective, to a judge, and finally to a courtroom full of strangers who'd never met my mother, but who cried right along with her when she testified. $25,412 wired, transferred, and drained out of a woman's retirement account because a man named Trevor Ashcombe told her he was dying. He wasn't dying. He wasn't even sick. He'd done this before. We'd find that out later, the hard way, the way you find out everything in a story like this. Too late to stop it, but not too late to make him pay for it. This is the story of how a man weaponized fear, faith, and a fake diagnosis to take my family's savings, and how we spent 14 months turning every receipt, every text message, and every wire transfer into a weapon of our own. He thought a good sob story and a burner phone were enough to disappear. He thought wrong. By the time we were done, he wasn't just paying my mother back, he was standing in front of a judge on 3 separate charges, facing restitution orders that would follow him for the rest of his working life, and watching his name get read into a public court record that anyone, any future girlfriend, any future landlord, any future employer, could find with a 5-second search. They thought they got away with it. They were wrong. Hey, welcome back. If this is your first time here, this channel is dedicated to one thing: telling the real stories of people who got scammed, defrauded, or financially betrayed, and then fought back and won. No fluff, no fake drama, just the paper trail, the legal strategy, and the moment justice actually lands. Today's story is about greed, betrayal, and getting every single dollar back. It's about a con man who specifically targets grieving, generous, faith-driven families, and about what happens when one of those families turns out to have a daughter who used to work in insurance claims investigation, and absolutely will not let this go. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because next week's story involves a fake contractor, a forged lien, and a house that almost got stolen out under an 81-year-old widow. You don't want to miss it. Now, back to Trevor. Before I get into how Trevor operated, I want to give you a clear picture of my mother's actual financial situation, because understanding what was realistically at stake helps explain both why this hurt so much and why she was, in a very specific sense, a well-chosen target rather than a random one. My parents were solidly middle class their whole lives. My dad worked 31 years as a facilities manager for a regional hospital system. My mom ran the books for a small independent accounting office for over a decade before retiring early to help care for her own aging mother. They paid off their modest 3-bedroom house 11 years before my dad passed. They had no significant debt beyond a home equity line of credit taken out the year before his death to cover a roof replacement, which they'd budgeted to pay down steadily over roughly 4 years. My father's life insurance policy, combined with his pension survivor benefit and their modest joint retirement savings, left my mother financially stable but not wealthy, comfortable enough to live on for the rest of her life if she was careful, but without the kind of cushion that could absorb a $25,000 hit without real consequences. That's an important detail because predators like Trevor Ashcombe aren't necessarily hunting for the wealthiest possible targets. They're hunting for people with meaningful, accessible liquid savings, recent major life disruption, and, crucially, enough financial literacy to move money competently themselves without needing anyone else's help or oversight to complete a wire transfer, which ironically made my mother a more efficient target than someone less financially capable might have been. My name's not going to matter much in this story. What matters is my mother, Diane. Diane was 66 years old, recently widowed. My father, Gerald, passed away 18 months before any of this started, from a heart attack that came out of nowhere on a Tuesday morning while he was making coffee. She'd spent 39 years married to that man, and when he died, she didn't just lose a husband, she lost her financial co-pilot, her second opinion, her built-in skepticism. My dad was the one who read every contract twice. My dad was the one who said, "Let me sleep on it," to every salesman who ever knocked on our door. My mom was the trusting one, the one who baked banana bread for new neighbors, who believed people generally meant well, who thought twice before saying no to somebody in genuine need. That combination, recent grief, financial responsibility she'd never fully carried alone, and a deep, sincere generosity made her exactly the profile that men like Trevor Ashcombe go looking for, not randomly, deliberately. I want to be clear about something up front, because I think it matters for anyone watching this who's been through something similar. My mother is not a foolish woman. She ran a small accounting office for over a decade. She balanced our family checkbook to the penny for 40 years. This isn't a story about a gullible victim. This is a story about a predator who understood exactly which emotional levers to pull and pulled them with surgical precision. My mom met Trevor at her grief support group. Not a scam-adjacent group, not an online forum, an actual in-person church basement grief support group that met every Wednesday night. The kind of group that exists specifically to help people survive losing a spouse. She'd been going for about 4 months. Trevor showed up in month 5, introduced himself as someone who'd lost his wife to ovarian cancer 2 years earlier. He was 58, well-dressed but not flashy, soft-spoken, and, this is the part that still makes my skin crawl, genuinely good at listening. He remembered details. He asked follow-up questions the next week about things my mom had mentioned in passing. He cried convincingly when he talked about his late wife. We would later learn that Trevor Ashcombe had never been married. There was no dead wife. There was, in fact, a whole different grief support group 2 towns over, where he'd told a completely different story. A dead son, that time, lost to a car accident. Same warm, listening presence, same slow, patient build. This is what a professional predator's timeline actually looks like, and I want to walk through it because if you're watching this and something in your gut is telling you a pattern feels familiar, I need you to trust that instinct. Week 1 to 4, pure listening. No asks, no red flags, nothing but warmth and presence. He complimented her strength. He told her she processed grief in a way he admired. Week 5 to 8, the friendship deepens outside the group. Coffee after the Wednesday meetings, a phone call here and there, just to check in. He starts calling her one of the only people who really gets it. Week 9 to 12, he begins to selectively disclose vulnerability, financial strain from his late wife's medical bills, distance from his estranged son, a sense of being alone in the world. Nothing that asks for money, just enough to make my mother feel like she was one of the few people who truly knew him. Week 13, the first small ask. Not money, a favor. He asked her to drive him to a doctor's appointment because his car was in the shop. She said yes without hesitation. Looking back now with the full picture, the red flags are almost embarrassingly obvious. At the time, in the fog of my mother's grief and Trevor's careful pacing, they were nearly invisible. Red flag 1, he never wanted to meet any of us, her kids, her siblings, her longtime friends. Every excuse was reasonable in isolation. He was shy in groups. He was still healing. He didn't want to impose. In hindsight, isolating the target from her support network is predatory playbook 101. Red flag 2. His story had small inconsistencies that my mother, in her grief and her trust, simply smoothed over in her own mind. He once said his late wife died at Sacred Heart Hospital. A few weeks later, he mentioned Providence Memorial. When my mother gently asked about it, he got quiet and said, "Sorry, I still get confused. There were so many hospital visits toward the end." She apologized to him for bringing it up. Red flag 3. He was cagey about where he lived. He always came to her. He never had her over. He said his apartment was a mess and he was embarrassed by it since Linda passed. There was no Linda. There was no apartment we could later find any lease for under his real name. Red flag 4. He talked about money in a very specific way, never asking directly, always framing his own financial stress as something he was managing with dignity, which, perversely, made my mother trust him more. Someone who talks about money that carefully, she thought, would never actually ask you for any. That, it turns out, was the whole point. 6 months into the friendship, Trevor told my mother he'd been having stomach pain for weeks. He'd put off getting it checked out because, of course, money was tight and his insurance had lapsed after Linda's treatments wiped out their savings. 2 weeks later, Trevor called my mother in tears. He'd finally gone to urgent care. They'd run scans. He used the words mass and concerning and oncology referral. He said the word he never quite said outright was cancer, but he let her fill that word in herself, which she did, instantly and completely. He wasn't asking for anything. That's the part that made it work. He told her, almost apologetically, that he didn't want her to worry, that he'd figure it out, that he'd been through this once before with Linda, and he knew how to survive bad news. He said the hardest part wasn't the diagnosis, it was facing it completely alone. My mother spent that whole night unable to sleep. By morning, she'd decided, entirely on her own, without any direct request from Trevor, that she was going to help him pay for treatment. That's the con. He never asked. She offered. And when a person offers rather than gets asked, they defend the decision to everyone, including, eventually, to us, with a fierceness that made the fraud almost impossible to interrupt in real time. Over the following 5 weeks, my mother wired money in 4 separate transactions: $6,000 for what he called the initial oncology consultation and imaging package, $8,500 for a specialist second opinion and pre-authorization deposit at a clinic he said was out of network, $7,200 for a treatment slot deposit at a facility he claimed had a cancellation and could get him in faster than the 6-week public wait, and finally, $3,712 for what he described as incidental costs: gas, parking, a wig because he told her the oncologist warned chemo was likely. $25,412. Every dollar of it wired directly to accounts Trevor controlled, using banking details he provided over text message, always with some reason why a check or an in-person transfer wouldn't work in time given the urgency of his care. She told me about it 3 weeks after the last transfer, not because she was suspicious, because she was proud of herself for being there for a friend the way she wished someone had been there for her when my father died. That's when I felt the first cold drop of dread in my stomach, the kind you get when someone you love says something so trusting, so vulnerable, and every instinct in your own body is screaming that something is deeply, dangerously wrong. I remember the exact moment my mother told me about the money, because it's one of those conversations that splits your understanding of a relationship into before and after. We were on the phone on a Sunday evening. She was in a good mood, lighter than she'd sounded in months, and she told me she had some news she was excited to share. "I did something I'm really proud of," she said. "You know Trevor from the group. He got some scary news from the doctor. I helped him out with some of the costs." I asked, carefully, how much "some of the costs" meant. She told me the first number, $6,000, like she was telling me she'd donated to a school fundraiser. Warm, satisfied, certain she'd done something good. I asked if there were more payments after that one. There was a pause on the line, and then she told me, matter-of-factly, about the second and the third and the fourth, adding them up out loud for what she said was the first time she'd actually done the full math herself: $25,412. She said the number almost cheerfully, the way you'd announce a total on a receipt you were happy to have paid. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. I was doing my own math, not of the dollar amount, but of every reason a supposed cancer patient would need 4 separate cash infusions wired directly to him rather than paid to an actual medical provider, an insurance company, or a hospital billing department. "Mom," I said, as gently as I could manage while my stomach turned over, "can you do me a favor and just hold off on anything else for a little while? I want to look into something." She agreed, a little confused by my tone, and I told her I loved her and hung up, and then I sat at my kitchen table for a long time before I opened my laptop. I want to slow down here because I think this part of the story is actually the most valuable part for anyone watching who wants to protect a parent, a grandparent, or a friend from something similar. Predatory grief con artists don't improvise their pacing. They follow a rhythm that's been refined, sometimes over years and multiple targets, to feel completely organic to the person on the receiving end. My mother later told me, once we'd pieced together the full timeline, that Trevor had a habit of bringing small, thoughtful gestures early on: a card on the anniversary of my father's death, a text on what would have been their wedding anniversary, small things that cost him nothing but that landed enormously for a woman who felt like the rest of the world had quietly moved on from her grief while she was still living inside it every day. He also did something I've since learned is disturbingly common in these schemes. He mirrored her language back to her. If she used a particular phrase to describe her own grief, a specific image about carrying weight around everywhere she went, he would use that same phrase back to her weeks later, describing his own supposed grief in nearly identical terms. It made her feel deeply understood. It was, in reality, a technique, not a coincidence, and once you know to look for it, it's chilling how mechanical it becomes in retrospect. There was also a financial adjacent test run that I didn't mention earlier, because at the time, none of us clocked it as significant. About 7 weeks before the fake diagnosis, Trevor asked my mother to front him $60 for a group dinner reservation deposit, since his card had been declined at the restaurant and he was embarrassed in front of the group. He paid her back within 3 days, in cash, with a small bouquet of flowers as a thank you. That $60 test is textbook. It establishes a precedent of he always pays people back. It removes the psychological friction around future, larger financial exchanges, and it costs the con artist almost nothing relative to what it buys him in trust. When the $25,000 ask, or rather the $25,000 offer my mother made unprompted, eventually came, that $25 repayment sat quietly in the back of her mind as proof that Trevor was, in her words, someone who always made things right. I did a fair amount of reading during and after this whole ordeal, partly to understand what happened to my mother, and partly, honestly, out of a need to make sense of something that felt senseless. What I found is that grief group fraud, sometimes called sweetheart swindling or bereavement fraud in consumer protection literature, follows a documented and disturbingly consistent pattern across a wide range of reported cases nationally. Financial predators specifically favor grief support environments for several structural reasons that have nothing to do with luck. First, attendance at these groups is by definition limited to people who have recently experienced a major loss, which means the population is pre-filtered for a specific kind of emotional vulnerability, without the con artist having to do any of that filtering themselves. Second, these groups create an artificial sense of instant intimacy and trust. People share deeply personal information about their spouses, their finances, their fears, often within the first few sessions, in a way that would take months or years to develop in an ordinary social setting. Third, and this is the part that makes me angriest, the social contract of a grief support group actively discourages skepticism. Questioning another member's story, asking for verification, expressing doubt, all of it reads as a violation of the compassionate, non-judgmental space the group exists to provide, which means the exact behaviors that would normally protect someone from fraud are the behaviors the environment itself trains people to suppress. Consumer protection data on romance and companionship fraud broadly, which grief group fraud is a specific, particularly cruel subcategory of, consistently shows that victims over 50 account for a disproportionate share of both the total number of reported cases and the total dollar amount lost, precisely because predators understand that this demographic often has more accessible savings, a stronger sense of social obligation once trust is established, and, frequently, less family oversight of day-to-day financial decisions than younger victims might have. None of that makes my mother, or Karen's mother, or Patricia foolish. It makes them statistically, structurally targeted by people who study exactly this profile and build entire repeatable methodologies around exploiting it. I have a younger brother, Mark, who lives out of state and who wasn't as involved in my mother's day-to-day life during this period. When I first told him what was happening, before we had the full picture, his instinct was anger, not at Trevor but at my mother, which is an unfortunately common reaction in families going through this, and one I want to specifically caution against. He said things in that first phone call that he later deeply regretted, including asking her, point blank, how she could not have known, a question that does nothing but deepen the shame a victim already feels, and makes them dramatically less likely to be forthcoming about the full scope of what happened. I asked him to sit with that reaction privately rather than voice it to her again, and to instead focus his energy on something productive, in his case, gigging through my dad's old files for any paperwork related to my mother's accounts, since he had power of attorney documentation from an earlier estate planning conversation that we ended up needing later in the process. By the time we got to the investigation phase, Mark had become one of our most valuable resources, specifically because he channeled that initial anger into useful work, instead of directing it at the one person in this story who least deserved it.
I want to walk you through exactly how I responded, because I think the instinct a lot of people have, including a lot of you watching this, is to panic and immediately accuse. That's the worst thing you can do. The moment you accuse someone of running a con on your mother, you give the con man a script for exactly how to react: righteous anger, wounded pride, and a fast exit. So I didn't accuse. I asked questions. I asked my mom to tell me about Trevor's cancer diagnosis: what kind, what hospital, what oncologist, what the treatment plan was. She didn't know most of the specifics. She knew he was seeing someone downtown and that the clinic was called something like Meridian Oncology Partners. I looked it up that night. There was no Meridian Oncology Partners in our city, our county, or within 120 miles of us. There was a completely unrelated business by a similar name in another state that had nothing to do with oncology at all. It was a dental supply distributor. That's when I found the smoking gun. Not the last one, not the biggest one, but the first one. A cancer clinic that didn't exist. I didn't tell my mother yet. I know some of you watching are yelling at the screen right now, saying I should have told her immediately. Here's why I didn't. Grief-based fraud victims frequently, and I mean frequently, defend their scammer even after being shown hard evidence, at least in the first exposure. I needed more than one broken detail. I needed an undeniable case because I only had one shot at getting through to her before she either sent more money or, worse, warned Trevor that someone in the family was asking questions. So over the following 10 days, I quietly built a file. I asked my mother, under the pretense of wanting to send Trevor a care package, for his full name, his phone number, and any address she had for him. She gave me a name, Trevor Ashcombe, a cell number, and no fixed address, just he's staying with a cousin right now since his lease ended. I ran the phone number through a reverse lookup service. It came back associated with a prepaid carrier account, registered 3 months earlier, right around the time he'd shown up at the grief group. Not proof of fraud by itself, but a real estate agent doesn't get a burner phone. A con man setting up a new target does. I searched the name Trevor Ashcombe alongside our city. Nothing recent. I searched it alongside the neighboring county where I'd later learn he'd run his previous grief group con. Still nothing directly. He was careful about his digital footprint under that particular name. But I found something else. a small 3-comment thread on a local community Facebook group from over a year earlier, in which a woman described a man matching Trevor's general description and mannerisms, down to the phrase, processed grief in a way I admired, who had befriended a recently widowed mother at a bereavement support group 2 towns over, and who had also claimed a cancer diagnosis before disappearing with roughly $18,000.
That was the moment the floor actually dropped out from under me. This wasn't improvisation. This was a routine, a well-rehearsed, repeatable, portable con that this man had run before, successfully, and would keep running as long as nobody stopped him. I messaged the woman from that thread. Her name was Karen. She confirmed everything within 20 minutes of my first message. Same physical description, same soft-spoken cadence, same fake dead wife named Linda, even the same claimed hospital name, Sacred Heart, that Trevor had used with my mother before switching his story to Providence Memorial. Karen's mother had lost $18,300. She'd never gotten a cent back. The police in her jurisdiction had opened a case and closed it within 2 months, citing insufficient evidence to identify a suspect, since Trevor had used a different name with her family entirely, Thomas Ashford. Same initials, same cadence, a predator who liked keeping some continuity in his aliases, which, as we'd learn, would actually work against him later. Armed with Karen's account, screenshots of the fake clinic's non-existence, the burner phone registration date, and a timeline that lined up too precisely to be coincidence, I sat down with my mother. I didn't lead with accusations. I led with a question. "Mom, can I show you something, and can you just look at it with me before you say anything?" I laid it all out: the non-existent clinic, the burner phone, Karen's story, the matching details. My mother's first reaction was denial, not hostile, but the quiet, devastated kind. She said there had to be an explanation. Maybe the clinic had a different official name. Maybe the phone company made an error. Maybe Karen was talking about a different man entirely. I let her sit with it. I didn't push. I said, "I understand why you want there to be an explanation. I want there to be one too. Let's just find out together instead of guessing." I asked her permission to call Trevor directly on speakerphone with her present and ask him one simple, verifiable question, the name and phone number of his oncologist's office, so we could send flowers and a card. Trevor hesitated, just for a second, but I heard it, and so did my mother. Then he said the office didn't take outside calls for privacy reasons, and that he'd pass the message along himself.
I pushed, gently but directly. "Trevor, I completely understand privacy concerns, but surely they can at least confirm a mailing address so we can send something, or even just the name of the office so we can look up their general visiting hours." There was a longer pause this time. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted, still soft, but with a defensive edge underneath it that hadn't been there a minute earlier. He said he found it a little hurtful that we needed to verify something so personal, and that he'd expected more trust from people he considered close to him during the hardest fight of his life. My mother, to her enormous credit, didn't back down, even as I could see the old instinct to apologize and soothe him flickering across her face. She said simply, "I just want to send flowers, Trevor. That's all this is." He said he'd think about it and get back to us, and then, within 48 hours, his number was disconnected entirely. That hesitation was the second smoking gun, and this one my mother heard with her own ears. Once the fog started to clear, we sat down and added up the full financial picture, which was worse than I initially understood. It wasn't just the $25,412 that had been wired directly to Trevor. My mother had also, in the weeks surrounding the wires, withdrawn roughly $1,800 in cash in case he needed anything quickly, most of which she couldn't fully account for having actually given him, meaning it's possible, though we could never fully prove, that some cash also changed hands informally.
She'd also missed 2 mortgage-adjacent payments. She didn't have a mortgage anymore, but she'd fallen behind on a home equity line of credit she'd taken out the year before for a roof repair, because the money that would have covered those HELOC payments had gone to Trevor instead. That meant late fees, a ding to her credit score, and, this is the part that made me the angriest, genuine, sleepless night anxiety about whether she was going to lose access to funds she needed for her own basic stability, on top of the underlying theft itself. The emotional damage was, in a lot of ways, worse than the financial damage. My mother is a proud, capable woman, and the realization that she'd been manipulated this thoroughly, this specifically while she was at her most vulnerable, hit her confidence in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. For about 3 weeks after the confrontation, she barely left the house. She stopped going to the grief group entirely, which meant she lost a source of genuine community support on top of everything else Trevor had already taken from her. Before we escalated to law enforcement, we tried, naively in retrospect, to resolve this directly. My mother, at my urging but very much of her own volition, texted Trevor and asked him plainly, was the diagnosis real and could he please return the money if it wasn't? He responded almost immediately with what I can only describe as a masterclass in deflection. He expressed hurt that she would believe internet rumors over him. He said Karen's story was a coincidence and that he felt sorry for whatever man actually did that to her family. He said the reason he couldn't produce clinic paperwork was that he was still processing his health crisis emotionally and didn't want to turn his health crisis into a bureaucratic exercise. He did not, at any point in that conversation, offer to return a single dollar. 2 days later, his number was disconnected. The prepaid line had gone dark. He'd used our confrontation as the signal to disappear, which, ironically, was the clearest confirmation yet that everything Karen and I had pieced together was true, because an actual cancer patient doesn't vanish the moment his girlfriend's family asks a hard question. That was the moment this stopped being a family misunderstanding and became a criminal investigation. A few days after Trevor's number went dark, I had a second, longer conversation with my mother, the one I actually consider the real turning point of this entire story, more than any piece of forensic evidence I'd gathered. She told me she felt stupid. She used that word unprompted more than once. She told me she felt like she'd betrayed her father's memory by letting someone take advantage of her so soon after losing him, and that she was terrified of what people at the grief group and what Mark and what I myself thought of her. I told her something I want to repeat here for anyone watching who's in her position right now or who loves someone who is. The fact that this worked on her is not evidence of her weakness. It's evidence of Trevor's skill, refined over years and multiple victims, specifically engineered to work on intelligent, capable, and emotionally healthy people who happen to be grieving. Con artists at this level do not succeed against foolish targets. They succeed against generous ones. Those are not the same thing, and conflating them is exactly what lets shame silence victims and lets predators keep operating. That conversation is also where she agreed, fully and without hesitation once she understood the stakes, to pursue this as far as it needed to go, not for the money alone, but because of what she learned from Karen's story, that Trevor was very likely still out there, still hunting. Once we understood the receiving account belonged to something called Ashcombe Family Holdings LLC, I want to walk through exactly how we approached the bank, because the order of operations here matters, and a lot of victims skip a step that ends up costing them the small amount of recoverable funds that might still be sitting in an account. I had my mother call her own bank's fraud department first, not the receiving bank, since as the account holder who authorized the transfer, she was the one with standing to dispute it as fraudulently induced by false representation of a medical emergency, rather than a more emotional, less actionable description of what had happened. the fraud department opened a formal case and critically was able to flag the receiving institution to freeze any remaining balance in the Ashcombe Family Holdings LLC account while the dispute was under review, which is exactly the mechanism that preserved the $4,100 we eventually recovered before Trevor could withdraw the remainder. Separately, I searched the LLC name through our state's Secretary of State Business Entity Search, a free public tool available in essentially every state, and found that Ashcombe Family Holdings LLC had been registered only 5 months before my mother's first wire transfer, listed a residential mailbox service as its registered address rather than any actual business location, and had no corresponding business license, tax filings, or any other public business activity beyond that single banking relationship. That paper-thin corporate shell, on its own, wasn't proof of fraud in a legal sense, but it was one more thread that, combined with everything else, painted an unmistakable picture for both Detective Vaughn and, eventually, the prosecutor. Beyond the $25,412 in direct wires, we eventually cataloged the fuller cost of what happened, because a case built only around the headline number misses a lot of what a judge, a detective, and eventually a jury need to understand about the true scope of harm. My mother's home equity line of credit fell 2 payments behind, generating $340 in late fees and a temporary interest rate adjustment that cost her an additional $612 over the following year, before we got it corrected with the lender once we explained the fraud circumstances in writing. Her credit score dropped 61 points over that period, which limited her ability to refinance a different, smaller debt at a better rate, a downstream cost that's easy to overlook, but that we included, with documentation, in our eventual restitution request. She also missed roughly 6 weeks of grief group attendance during the worst of the emotional fallout, which her own therapist, she started seeing one during this period, which I fully supported, later noted had a measurable impact on her broader emotional recovery from my father's death, since the group had been one of her primary support structures, and she'd voluntarily withdrawn from it out of shame. None of that shows up in a simple headline about a stolen $25,000. All of it mattered enormously to the actual human being living through it, and all of it became part of the record we eventually built. One of the hardest things to accept early in this process was learning just how limited our options were to simply reverse the transfers, once we knew they were fraudulent. This is worth explaining clearly because I think a lot of people assume banks can just call back money the way you might cancel a check. Domestic wire transfers, unlike credit card charges or even standard ACH transfers, are designed to be close to final and irreversible within a short window, specifically because that finality is a feature the banking system relies on for legitimate, high-value, time-sensitive transactions like real estate closings. Consumer protections like Regulation E, which governs a lot of electronic fund transfer disputes, provide meaningful recourse for certain categories of unauthorized transactions. But a wire that a victim personally, knowingly authorized, even a wire authorized because of fraudulent misrepresentation by the recipient, sits in a much grayer, harder to dispute category than a transaction where the victim's account was accessed without their knowledge or consent at all. That distinction is exactly why our bank was only able to recover $4,100 of the $25,412, and only because a small remaining balance happened to still be sitting in the receiving LLC account at the moment the fraud was confirmed and the account was frozen. Once funds are withdrawn as cash, they are, for all practical purposes, gone from the banking system's ability to trace or claw back, which is precisely why Trevor structured his withdrawals the way he did: 6 separate cash withdrawals across 3 branches within 11 days, specifically to get the money out of any traceable digital form as quickly as possible.
This is also why prevention matters so much more than recovery in these cases. The family conversation I recommend later in this video about requiring a second set of eyes on any large transfer before it happens exists precisely because the system is built in a way that makes after-the-fact recovery genuinely difficult, even when law enforcement, the bank, and the victim's family are all fully cooperating and moving as fast as possible. I want to be upfront about something. I am not a lawyer, and at the time, none of us were law enforcement professionals. What I was someone who'd spent 6 years working insurance investigation before switching careers, which meant I understood two things most victims don't going in. First, that documentation beats memory every single time. Second, that agencies respond to organized, well-labeled evidence dramatically faster than they respond to an emotional phone call, however justified that emotion is. So before I called a single agency, I built a case file. I want to walk through exactly what went into it because if you're watching this after going through something similar, this structure is the single most useful thing I can hand you. Section 1. Financial evidence. Bank statements showing all 4 wire transfers with dates, amounts, and the receiving account and routing numbers. My mother's bank was able to provide the name on the receiving account once we filed a fraud dispute. It came back to an LLC called Ashcombe Family Holdings, which, red flag number 1000, had been registered only 5 months earlier and had no actual business filings, licenses, or public presence beyond that single bank account. Section 2. Communications evidence. Every text message between my mother and Trevor, exported and printed with timestamps. Every claim he made about the diagnosis, the clinic, the treatment timeline, laid out in his own words, in writing, with dates that we could cross-reference against the wire transfer dates.
Section 3. Corroborating witness evidence. Karen's statement in writing with her own bank records showing the $18,300 her mother had sent to Thomas Ashford, using a matching physical description and matching phrases. Section 4. Identity evidence. The burner phone's carrier and activation date. The LLC registration paperwork publicly available through the Secretary of State's business search. Any photos my mother had of Trevor, which, thank God, she did have, from a group photo at the grief support meeting. Here's where things cracked wide open. I took the clearest photo we had of Trevor's face and ran it through a reverse image search. Nothing came back directly. He wasn't sloppy enough to have his real face indexed under his cons. But I also tried something else. I searched a partial, cropped version of the photo alongside general search terms like grief support scam, fake cancer diagnosis fraud, and our general region. That's when I found it. A regional news station roughly 14 months earlier had run a brief consumer alert segment about an unidentified man targeting recently widowed women at grief support groups across 3 counties, using fake terminal illness stories to solicit money. The segment included a still image from a doorbell camera, grainy but unmistakably the same build, the same distinctive gait, the same slightly too formal blazer over collared shirt look Trevor always wore. That segment had a tip line. I called it that same afternoon. I want to be clear about jurisdiction here because a lot of victims get stuck at exactly this point, unsure of where to even start. We filed in 3 places simultaneously, and I'd recommend anyone in a similar position do the same. First, a police report with our local department specifically framed and documented as financial exploitation and wire fraud, not just a vague scam complaint. Framing matters enormously. Many departments have specific elder financial exploitation units or detectives, and my mother, at 66, in our state, qualified for those protections given the targeting pattern and her status as a widow specifically sought out for vulnerability. Second, a report with the Federal Trade Commission through their official complaint system, which doesn't directly prosecute individual cases, but which feeds into a shared national database that other agencies, including the FBI, actively search when building patterns across multiple victims. Third, given that the transfers had crossed state lines through the banking system and that we now had a second victim in a different jurisdiction, we submitted a tip directly to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, IC3, which handles exactly this kind of cross-jurisdictional financial fraud.
Here's something I want to say clearly, because it's not always the experience people have, and I think it's worth acknowledging when it goes right. The detective assigned to our local report, Detective Renata Vaughn, took this seriously from the first meeting. She told us straight up that isolated, elder-targeted grief fraud cases are notoriously hard to prosecute because victims are often too ashamed to come forward, and because perpetrators specifically choose marks who won't have a tech-savvy family member building a case file the way I had. She said, almost verbatim, "You've done half my job for me already." That case file, organized, labeled, chronological, was the difference between a report that sits in a drawer and a report that gets an actual detective assigned actively working it within a week. Detective Vaughn was able to subpoena the bank records tied to the Ashcombe Family Holdings LLC account, which confirmed that our $25,412 hadn't gone anywhere near a hospital, an oncology clinic, or any medical provider. It had been withdrawn as cash in 6 transactions at 3 different branches within 11 days of arriving, and a portion, about $9,000, had been used to pay off a car loan under Trevor's actual legal name, which the bank subpoena finally revealed, Trevor Dale Wenzel. That's when I found the smoking gun that actually mattered most, his real legal identity, buried under 2 known aliases connected by a bank account he'd been careless enough to link to a personal auto loan. Here's the part of this story that still makes my stomach drop when I think about it. Roughly 3 weeks into the active investigation, Trevor Wenzel, using yet another alias, David Ashwell, attempted to open a new relationship with a widow at a grief support group 40 minutes from us, in a jurisdiction that had no idea an active investigation existed. We only found out because Karen, who I'd stayed in close contact with, had joined an online support forum for adult children of scam victims, where a woman posted almost in passing about a sweet man who'd started attending her mother's grief group and who'd mentioned, within the first month, a concerning set of test results. Karen recognized the pattern instantly and messaged me. I called Detective Vaughn immediately. Because we already had an active, documented case with a confirmed identity, she was able to move fast, coordinating with the neighboring jurisdiction's detective to intervene before a single dollar changed hands, using our evidence to establish probable cause for a welfare check and identity confirmation on David Ashwell. He was, of course, Trevor Wenzel. If Karen hadn't been in that forum, if she hadn't recognized the pattern, if she hadn't messaged me that same day, there's a real chance a 4th family, because Karen's mother made 2, mine made 3, would have lost their savings too, and Trevor might have had enough time to disappear entirely before any of us built a strong enough case to stop him.
That's the moment I stopped thinking of this as getting our money back and started thinking of it as making sure he couldn't do this to anyone else. I want to spend a moment on Karen because she became such a central part of how this case actually got solved, and because I think her story illustrates something important about how isolated these frauds can feel before victims find each other. Karen was 34, a schoolteacher, living about 90 minutes from us. Her mother, Sandra, had lost her husband to a stroke almost 2 years before Trevor, going by Thomas Ashford at the time, targeted her at a different grief support group in her town. Karen told me that when she'd first discovered the fraud, she'd spent months feeling like her family was the only one this had ever happened to, which made the whole experience feel isolating in a way that compounded the financial damage with a kind of quiet, private shame neither she nor her mother spoke about outside their own household. When I first messaged her cold after finding that old community Facebook thread, she told me later she almost didn't respond, assuming it might be some kind of follow-up scam targeting the original victims a second time. She only replied because I included specific, verifiable details from the thread that a scammer wouldn't have had reason to reference. Once we connected, we spent hours on the phone comparing notes. The phrase, processed grief in a way I admired, the fictional dead wife, Linda, the same soft-spoken, patient pacing over months rather than weeks. By the end of that first call, neither of us had any doubt we were describing the same man, and Karen made the decision on the spot to formally reopen her mother's case with her local department and reference our active investigation, which is exactly the kind of victim-to-victim connection that transforms isolated, unsolved reports into a prosecutable pattern. Around the same time we filed the police report, we also retained a consumer fraud attorney on a limited scope basis, specifically to help us understand our civil options running parallel to the criminal case, and to help my mother formally request restitution as part of any eventual plea or sentencing. I want to explain the distinction here, because a lot of victims don't realize criminal and civil paths are separate and can run alongside each other. The criminal case, the one Detective Vaughn and eventually the FBI were building, exists to punish Trevor for breaking the law and, through restitution, to try to make victims financially whole as part of that punishment. A civil case, by contrast, would have been our own family directly suing Trevor for damages, entirely separate from whether he was ever criminally charged at all. Our attorney advised that giving Trevor's apparent lack of significant recoverable assets, a civil suit would likely result in what's called a judgment-proof defendant, meaning we could win a judgment on paper but have no meaningful way to actually collect on it, since you cannot get blood from a stone. She recommended we focus our energy on the criminal restitution path instead, where the state's enforcement mechanisms, including wage garnishment authority, gave us a dramatically better chance of eventually recovering something real.
That single piece of legal advice probably saved our family thousands of dollars in additional attorney's fees chasing a civil judgment that would have looked good on paper and produced nothing in practice. Karen wasn't the only additional victim we found during the investigation. Detective Vaughn, working with the SBI's IC3 referral, identified a third confirmed victim, a woman named Patricia in a state 2 states away who had lost approximately $19,600 to a man calling himself Terry Ashwood, roughly 2.5 years before Trevor targeted my mother. Patricia's story followed the identical playbook: a grief support group, a fabricated late wife named Linda, a slow-building friendship, and eventually a fabricated cancer diagnosis used to solicit escalating treatment cost wires. Patricia had reported the fraud to her local police at the time, but without a name or address that led anywhere real, and without any other known victims to establish a pattern, her case had gone cold within months. When Detective Vaughn contacted her as part of our active investigation, Patricia told her she'd assumed for 2.5 years that she was simply the unlucky victim of a random, unrepeatable con. She had no idea he'd done this before her, and no idea he'd go on to do it again after. That reunion of victims, Patricia's, Karen's mother, and mine, became one of the most powerful pieces of the eventual prosecution, because it transformed the case from one family's word against a stranger's into a documented, multi-state pattern of a repeat offender specifically targeting a vulnerable population using a consistent method. Once Detective Vaughn had probable cause to formally open the case, she was able to do something private citizens cannot: subpoena full banking records tied to both the Ashcombe Family Holdings LLC account and eventually Trevor's real personal accounts once his legal identity was confirmed.
Those records showed a financial history stretching back nearly 5 years, with deposit patterns that tracked almost line for line against the timelines Karen, Patricia, and my mother had each independently provided. Deposits arriving in clusters of 3 to 5 transactions over a 5 to 8 week window, followed by rapid cash withdrawals, followed by months of quiet, low-activity banking consistent with someone living modestly between cons. This is the kind of evidence an individual victim's family simply cannot obtain on their own, and it's exactly why filing the police report, even when it feels slow and bureaucratic in the moment, matters as much as the private investigative work I was doing on my own. My case file got a detective's attention. The subpoena power that followed is what turned that attention into an airtight prosecution. I want to spend a little more time on the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center specifically, because I think a lot of victims assume federal involvement is reserved for enormous headline-grabbing fraud cases, and don't realize how much smaller dollar cases benefit from that system simply existing. IC3 doesn't investigate every individual complaint directly. With the sheer volume of reports the center receives annually, that would be logistically impossible. What it does is aggregate complaints into a searchable database that field offices and local law enforcement partners can query when building a case, specifically looking for shared identifiers, phone numbers, bank account details, physical descriptions, aliases, and behavioral patterns like the ones Trevor exhibited across his known victims. Once our local detective flagged our case through the appropriate channel, the existing IC3 complaint history connected to Trevor's known aliases and banking patterns became available to inform the broader investigation, which is a meaningful part of how Patricia's 2.5-year-old cold case in another state ended up getting folded into the same prosecution as ours. Without that federal database layer, our case and Patricia's case would very likely have remained two isolated, unconnected reports in two different states, each too thin on its own to justify significant investigative resources. Once Trevor was in custody, a warrant allowed investigators to examine the device associated with the phone number he'd used with my mother. Even though the number itself had been disconnected, the phone's hardware and any accessible backup data provided additional confirmation, saved contacts under multiple names correlating to different aliases, text message drafts referencing the diagnosis story in a way that made clear premeditation rather than spontaneous deception, and location data placing the device at grief support meetings in at least 2 additional counties beyond the ones we already knew about. That location data alone opened up the possibility of 2 further unreported victims that investigators were still working to identify as of Trevor's sentencing, underscoring something Detective Vaughn told us early on and that has stuck with me since. For every victim who comes forward, there are very likely others who never do, whether out of shame, uncertainty, or simply never realizing they were targeted at all. Trevor Dale Wenzel was arrested 6 weeks after that near miss at a motel roughly 90 minutes from our home, where he'd been living under the David Ashwill identity while he assessed his next target. The arrest was coordinated across 2 county jurisdictions plus a referral from IC3, which had, by that point, connected his pattern to at least 2 additional victims in a neighboring state, going back nearly 4 years, meaning our $25,412 was very likely a fraction of what this man had stolen over the course of his career. He was charged with 3 separate offenses, and I want to walk through each one specifically, because understanding the charges is part of understanding why pressing every charge available actually matters for outcomes like this. Charge 1. Felony theft by deception. In our state, theft obtained through a knowingly false representation, in this case a fabricated medical diagnosis used specifically to induce a financial transfer, qualifies as theft by deception rather than simple theft, which matters because it establishes the fraudulent intent as central to the crime rather than incidental to it. Charge 2. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Because my mother was over 60, recently widowed, and was specifically targeted through a support group for grieving spouses, the state's Elder and Vulnerable Adult Protection Statute applied, which carries enhanced penalties precisely because the law recognizes that predators who target grief and age deserve harsher consequences than a generic fraud charge would provide. Charge 3. Wire fraud at the federal level. Because the transfers moved through interstate banking systems and because the FBI's involvement through IC3 had connected multiple victims across state lines, federal prosecutors filed a wire fraud charge, which, unlike the state charges, carries the possibility of significant federal prison time and comes with federal restitution enforcement mechanisms that are notoriously more aggressive than state-level restitution orders. Before I get into the plea negotiation itself, I want to explain the strategic thinking the prosecutor walked us through, because I think it demystifies something that can otherwise feel opaque and frustrating to victims watching a case move through the system from the outside. The assigned prosecutor explained that stacking multiple charges, state theft by deception, state elder financial exploitation, and federal wire fraud, wasn't about maximizing punishment for its own sake. It was a deliberate strategy to close off every avenue Trevor's defense might use to minimize the outcome. If the elder exploitation charge alone had been challenged on some technical detail specific to how vulnerable adult was defined in our state statute, the theft by deception charge would still stand independently. If the state case somehow ran into an unexpected procedural obstacle, the federal wire fraud charge, prosecuted separately by federal authorities with their own evidentiary standards, provided a completely independent path to both conviction and, importantly, federally enforced restitution. This is precisely the pressing every charge available strategy that matters so much in cases like this, and it's worth remembering if you're ever advising a friend or family member navigating something similar. Don't let anyone, including well-meaning family members eager for a fast resolution, talk you into accepting the first plea offer that surfaces just to make the process end sooner. The prosecutor told us plainly that first offers from a defense attorney are almost always an opening bid designed to minimize consequences, not a fair reflection of what the evidence actually supports. Trevor's attorney initially pushed for a plea deal that would have had him plead guilty only to the state theft charge in exchange for the elder exploitation and federal wire fraud charges being dropped. Detective Vaughn had warned us this might happen and had also told us something important. As victims, we had a right to submit a formal victim impact statement that the judge would review before accepting or rejecting any plea agreement. And prosecutors in cases like this often weigh victim input heavily, especially when there are multiple documented victims establishing a pattern. My mother wrote that statement herself. I helped her organize it, but every word of what she said about the years she lost, not just the money, but her trust in her own judgment, her withdrawal from a support community she badly needed, the sleepless nights worrying about her HELOC payments, were hers. The judge rejected the reduced plea. Trevor ultimately pleaded guilty to all 3 charges rather than risk trial, where the combined weight of Karen's mother's testimony, the near-miss intervention, the bank subpoena records, and my mother's own statement would have made conviction on all counts overwhelmingly likely. The sentencing outcome broke down like this: 18 months in state custody on the combined theft and elder exploitation charges, followed by 5 years of supervised probation with explicit conditions barring him from attending any grief support group, bereavement organization, or widow or widower community event in any capacity for the full length of his probation. On the federal wire fraud charge, he received a concurrent federal sentence structured so that his total combined time in custody didn't exceed the state sentence. But critically, the federal conviction came with a restitution order covering the full documented losses across all known victims: our $25,412, Karen's mother's $18,300, and roughly $31,000 in additional confirmed losses from 2 other victims the investigation had uncovered.
Total court-ordered restitution, $74,712 across 4 families, enforced through a federal restitution mechanism that garnishes future wages, tax refunds, and any future asset acquisitions until the full amount is paid, with interest, for as long as it takes. Here's the reality financially, and I want to be honest about it rather than oversell a Hollywood ending. Restitution orders don't pay out instantly. Trevor had no meaningful assets left by the time of sentencing. The LLC bank account had been drained. The car loan he'd paid off with part of my mother's money was in a car that got repossessed anyway after he stopped making payments on other debts, and he had no property in his name. What we did recover relatively quickly was $4,100, the portion of the funds the bank was able to claw back directly from the receiving account before it was fully emptied, recovered through the fraud dispute process my mother's bank pursued once law enforcement confirmed the criminal nature of the transfers. The remaining $21,132 is being repaid through the federal restitution garnishment structure at a pace tied to Trevor's post-release income, which, as of the most recent restitution report we received, about 4 months ago, has him on track to be fully repaid to our family in approximately 6.5 years, assuming consistent employment, which his probation terms require him to maintain and report. It's not instant, it's not dramatic, but it's real, it's legally enforceable, it follows him, and it is dramatically more than the $0 most victims in stories like this ever see, because so few families ever build the case file, work the multiple agencies, and push for restitution orders the way we did. Beyond the courtroom, we made a deliberate decision in coordination with Detective Vaughn and the local news outlet that had run that original Consumer Alert segment to go public with Trevor's real identity and his full pattern of aliases once his conviction was finalized. The station ran a follow-up segment naming Trevor Dale Wenzel specifically, detailing all 4 known aliases and explicitly warning grief support communities across the region to watch for him under any name, given his demonstrated pattern of using close variations. That segment has, as of this recording, been shared in at least 6 different grief support and elder care community Facebook groups that we know of. 2 separate people have since messaged either Karen or me directly to say that segment stopped them from investigating a new friend further after they recognized the pattern, which is frankly worth more to me than the dollar amount ever was. I also want to mention that going public wasn't a decision my mother made lightly. She worried initially about being publicly identified as a fraud victim, concerned that people would see the story and judge her rather than Trevor. Detective Vaughn and the news producer both gave her the option to remain anonymous in the segment, identified only as a local widow, and my mother sat with that option for almost a week before deciding, ultimately, that she wanted her actual first name used, though not our full family name, specifically because she felt that a real, named person attaching her voice to the warning would carry more weight with other potential victims than an anonymous composite ever could. She told me afterward that decision, more than almost anything else in this entire process, was the moment she stopped feeling like Trevor's victim and started feeling like someone actively working to stop him from having more. Here's the detail that still gets me, even now. We always assumed going in that a con man running this kind of scheme was funding some kind of lavish lifestyle, a boat, a gambling habit, something dramatic. The bank subpoena and Trevor's own financial records entered into evidence during sentencing told a much smaller, sadder, and in some ways more infuriating story. Roughly $9,000 of what he took from my mother went to paying off a car loan. Another significant portion went to back child support he owed from a marriage, an actual marriage, to an actual woman, decades earlier, that had ended badly and that he'd been avoiding paying into for years, with wage garnishment orders he was actively evading by working under assumed identities and being paid partially in cash. The rest went to ordinary living expenses. Rent under his aliases, a modest used vehicle, groceries, motel stays between cons. There was no dramatic villain's lair.
There was a man who had built an entire secondary identity system, complete with fabricated grief, fabricated cancer, and fabricated widowerhood, purely to fund an unremarkable, low-visibility life while dodging financial obligations he'd walked away from under his real name. In some ways, that made it worse. This wasn't a moment of desperation. This was a sustainable business model, refined over at least 4 years and multiple victims, built entirely on the specific and repeatable exploitation of grieving women's trust. That's precisely why the restitution order, the probation conditions, and the public exposure all mattered as much as the 18 months he actually served. A short sentence without those other consequences would have let him simply relocate, rebuild the same playbook under a 5th alias, and start over with victim number 5. The layered approach, criminal conviction, financial restitution, and public identification, is what actually closes that door. Detective Vaughn called me herself the morning of the arrest, which I hadn't expected. I assumed we'd hear about it secondhand, days later, through some formal notification letter. She said she wanted our family to hear it from her directly, given how much work we'd put into building the case alongside her department. She described it plainly, without embellishment, a coordinated approach involving 2 jurisdictions and a U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force assessed, given the multi-state nature of the identified victims. Trevor was located at a roadside motel using the David Ashwell identity, with a mostly packed suitcase in his room, which the arresting officers took as a strong indication he'd already sensed the walls closing in and was preparing to move on to a new location before they reached him. He did not resist. Detective Vaughn told us he asked, almost immediately upon being read his rights, whether this was about Diane, using my mother's actual first name rather than any of his aliases for her. A small, strange detail that stuck with all of us, since it meant that even mid-con he'd apparently kept track of which victim went with which real identity, treating an active human relationship as a filing system. I told my mother about the arrest that same evening, in person, sitting at her kitchen table, the same table, coincidentally, where my father used to sit reading the newspaper every morning before he passed. She cried, but she told me afterward it wasn't from sadness. It was, she said, the first moment in over a year that she felt like the ground under her had actually stopped shifting. The sentencing hearing itself lasted just under 3 hours, and I want to describe it because I think it matters for anyone who might one day sit in a courtroom like that themselves. Trevor appeared in a plain collared shirt, noticeably thinner than the photos from the grief group, flanked by his public defender. He did not look at my mother once during the proceedings, which she told me afterward was somehow worse than if he had. 3 victim impact statements were read into the record that day. Patricia's, submitted in writing and read aloud by the prosecutor since she couldn't travel. Karen's mother's, delivered in person, through tears. And my mother's, which she insisted on reading herself, despite her hands visibly shaking as she stood at the podium. She spoke about my father, about the grief group that was supposed to be a place of healing, and about how long it took her to trust her own judgment again after realizing how completely she'd been read and exploited. She did not ask the judge for anger on her behalf. She asked specifically that whatever sentence he receive include real enforceable restitution and a permanent restriction from grief support environments, because money alone, she said, wouldn't stop this from happening to someone else's mother. The judge, in handing down the sentence, specifically referenced the pattern across 3 known victims and the deliberate, calculated targeting of grief support communities as an aggravating factor justifying the enhanced elder exploitation charge rather than a lesser theft-only outcome. That's not a small legal detail. Aggravating factors like documented pattern and deliberate targeting of vulnerability are frequently the difference between a sentence that feels like a slap on the wrist and one that actually reflects the harm done. I'm recording this roughly a year and a half after Trevor's arrest, and I want to give you the most honest update I can, because I think stories like this owe their audience the follow-through, not just the satisfying climax. My mother has fully rejoined her grief support group, a different one now, one specifically informed of her situation by the facilitator, who has since implemented a light identity verification step for new members after what happened, something several other grief organizations in our region adopted after the news coverage. She slowly rebuilt her trust in her own judgment, though she told me recently that she still, almost a year and a half later, double and triple checks any new person who shows a little too much interest in her story, a little too quickly. I consider that healthy vigilance rather than lingering damage, and she agrees. The restitution payments have arrived on schedule so far, 4 payments totaling $2,850 as of our most recent statement, garnished directly from Trevor's post-release wages under the terms of his federal restitution order, arriving automatically without any action required on our part. At the current pace, full repayment of the remaining balance is projected within the timeline I mentioned earlier, assuming his employment and compliance remain steady, which his probation officer is required to monitor and report on.
Financially, we are not yet whole. Emotionally, in some ways, we are more whole than we were before any of this happened, because my mother now has a level of financial vigilance, a support system that actually knows her full story, and, frankly, a level of pride in having survived this and fought back that I don't think she'd trade away, even if I offered her the full $25,000 back today, no questions asked. Because a number of people who watch these stories ask specifically about this part, I want to explain in plain terms exactly how the ongoing restitution mechanism functions, since it's genuinely different from how a lot of people imagine court-ordered repayment working. Once Trevor was released from custody onto supervised probation, the restitution order became a standing legal obligation tracked jointly by the court and his supervising probation officer. His employer, once he found qualifying work, as required under his probation terms, is legally obligated to garnish a percentage of his wages, capped under federal wage garnishment limits, designed to leave him enough income to maintain basic housing and living expenses, and that garnished amount is forwarded automatically through the court's financial administration system directly to the listed victims, divided proportionally according to each victim's documented losses relative to the total $74,712 restitution order. If Trevor were to lose a job, the obligation doesn't disappear. It accrues, and his probation officer is required to actively monitor his employment status and report any gaps, since failure to maintain qualifying employment or actively seek it can itself constitute a probation violation, carrying the possibility of additional custodial time. If he were to come into a lump sum of money through any legal channel, an inheritance, a settlement, a tax refund, that too becomes subject to the restitution order under most state and federal frameworks, meaning the obligation genuinely follows him for as long as it takes to satisfy it, not just for the length of his probation term. This is meaningfully different from a civil judgment, which, as our attorney explained early on, requires the winning party to actively pursue collection themselves, often at further legal expense, against a defendant who may have every incentive to hide or dissipate assets. Criminal restitution, enforced through the court and probation system, put the burden of active enforcement on the state rather than on our already exhausted family, which was in itself a form of justice I hadn't fully appreciated until we were living inside the alternative. If you take one thing away from this story, I want it to be this checklist, because I promise you someone in your life fits this profile of vulnerability right now, whether you realize it or not. Watch for isolation from existing support networks.
A new friend or partner who consistently avoids meeting family, avoids group settings, and always has a reasonable-sounding excuse is worth a second look, especially with someone recently widowed or otherwise grieving.
If this story resonated with you, or if something similar has happened in your family, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment below. Has anyone in your life been targeted by a scheme like this? What warning signs did you catch, or wish you had caught sooner? I asked my mother before I recorded this if there was anything specific she wanted me to say directly to you, the people watching this. She thought about it for a while, and then she told me this, more or less word for word, and I promised her I'd include it. She said she spent months blaming herself for something that was designed specifically and deliberately to be unrecognizable in the moment. She said the version of herself who wired that money wasn't foolish or careless. She was a grieving woman who wanted, more than almost anything else in the world at that point in her life, to believe that kindness still mattered, and that showing up for someone in crisis was the right thing to do. She said Trevor didn't just steal money from her, he took something that was genuinely good about her willingness to trust and to help, and turned it into the exact mechanism of her own harm, and that the recovery, for her, wasn't just about the restitution payments arriving on schedule. It was about getting to a place where she could be generous again, without that generosity feeling dangerous. She wanted me to tell you that if you're the trusting person in your family, the one who believes people generally mean well, the one who gives strangers the benefit of the doubt, that instinct isn't a flaw you need to fix. It's something worth protecting, with better systems and better checks around it, not something worth abandoning out of fear. The goal isn't to become suspicious of everyone. The goal is to build enough structure around your trust that people like Trevor Wenzel can't turn it into a weapon. Before the practical resources, I want to quickly answer a few questions people frequently ask in the comments on stories like this one, because I suspect some of you are wondering the same things right now. Why didn't you just go to the police immediately before doing your own research? Because a partial report, I think my mother's friend might be lying about cancer, without documentation, dates, or corroboration, often gets logged and effectively shelved, especially in departments without a dedicated financial crimes unit. Building the case file first meant that by the time we did file, the report came with enough substance to get a detective assigned quickly, rather than queued behind higher priority active cases. Couldn't the bank have just stopped the wires before they went through? Banks do run fraud detection algorithms on outgoing wires, but a wire authorized in person or by phone by the actual account holder for what she believed at the time was a legitimate personal purpose doesn't typically trigger the same red flags as, say, an unfamiliar login attempting a transfer to a brand new payee overseas. My mother wasn't a victim of account takeover, she was a victim of deception that led her to authorize the transfers herself, which is a fundamentally harder pattern for automated fraud detection to catch.
Is $74,712 in total restitution actually a lot for a case like this, or is that unusually high? It reflects the fact that we found 3 documented victims rather than 1. Many cases like this never uncover the full pattern, either because no other victims come forward or because no one connects the dots the way Karen's Facebook post allowed us to. I'd encourage anyone in a similar situation to actively search for other potential victims rather than assuming their family's loss was an isolated incident. What happened to the grief support group itself? Did they face any liability? In our case, no formal liability was pursued against the group or its facilitator since it was a volunteer-run, informal community group rather than a licensed care facility with a legal duty of supervision. That said, the facilitator did voluntarily implement the identity verification step I mentioned earlier once she learned what had happened, which several similar groups in our region have since adopted as a preventative best practice. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with a few concrete, practical steps beyond just the warning signs, because I know some of you watching this are dealing with something similar right now, not hypothetically. If money has already been wired or transferred, contact your bank's fraud department immediately and explicitly use the words fraudulent transfer rather than a vaguer term like mistake, since that specific framing often determines which internal fraud recovery process gets triggered and how quickly. File your police report in person if at all possible, rather than online only, and specifically request that it be categorized under financial exploitation or elder fraud if the victim qualifies by age or vulnerability status in your state, since specialized units often exist for exactly this category of crime and have more resources than a general property crime desk. File a complaint with the FTC through their official reporting system, and if there's any indication of interstate wire transfers or multiple victims, file a supplemental report with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center as well. These reports feed into shared databases that connect patterns across jurisdictions in ways that isolated local reports simply cannot. Consider reaching out to a consumer fraud attorney for even a single consultation, particularly to understand whether pursuing restitution through the criminal process or a separate civil claim makes more sense for your specific situation, since, as we learned, that answer depends heavily on the perpetrator's actual recoverable assets. If the victim in your family is over 60, most states also maintain a dedicated Adult Protective Services division specifically equipped to handle financial exploitation of older adults, and many local area agencies on aging can connect victims with free or low-cost legal aid specifically experienced in elder financial fraud recovery. These resources exist precisely because this category of crime is common enough and specialized enough to warrant dedicated infrastructure. You are not overreacting or wasting anyone's time by using them.
If you're a family member and you're not sure where to even begin having the initial documentation conversation with a parent or loved one who may be a victim, consider writing out your key questions in advance, the way I did before that second conversation with my mother, so the discussion stays focused on facts and support, rather than escalating into blame in the moment, which is easy to do even with the best intentions when emotions are running high on all sides. And if you're the family member trying to help, please lead with documentation and calm questions, rather than accusation and anger. The fastest way to lose access to the truth is to make the victim feel like coming forward means facing judgment from the people who are supposed to be safest to tell. Trevor Wenzel thought a fake diagnosis and a burner phone were enough to disappear with $25,000 of my family's money and move on to the next target. He miscalculated one specific thing. He picked a family with a daughter who used to investigate fraud for a living, a brother who redirected his anger into useful work instead of blame, and a mother whose grief made her generous, not foolish, and who refused to let shame keep her quiet once she understood what had actually happened to her. If this story resonated with you, or if something similar has happened in your family, I genuinely want to hear about it. Drop a comment below. Has anyone in your life been targeted by a scheme like this? What warning signs did you catch or wish you had caught sooner? Your comment might be the exact thing that helps someone else recognize what's happening to them before they lose a single dollar. Subscribe for next week's story, hit the notification bell so you don't miss it, and as always, protect your people. Document everything, and never let anyone convince you that asking questions is the same thing as lacking compassion.